Documentation is always important, but with all the startups that we talk to, we found that it always takes like third to fifth place. First production, then tests, then documentation, if there is time.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 156. Validate your API specifications with Cherry Bomb. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. As application developers, we spend lots of time writing code. That's our job. Right, Victor?
Depends. Maybe you're writing YAML. Would you be still application developer? And it auto-generates everything else.
But auto-generation. One of the things we can do with auto-generation, all joking aside, is if we were to write an open API spec, we could take that open API spec and generate all the things to actually implement that API, correct?
Yes. Actually, I'm still not sure about that one. I'm not sure whether we should write the spec first and then that generates code, or we should write the scaffold code just enough to generate spec from the code. You know, functions without really anything inside those functions, so that I'm not sure.
Well, there are two sides for that argument. There are some companies who would rather create the open API spec before. Those companies usually are usually a bit older in the average age of developer, and they usually have some analysts or DevOps work on the API spec from what the product manager told them, and then they can generate at least some gateway or router functions for it. It would not generate the entirety of the API, it would generate merely the router. So most companies choose to go the other way of writing the code for the router or the gateway, and then using some sort of a library or deploying a platform to produce their own open API specification based on the router/gateway code.
Let's start actually with the introduction. Guy, who are you?
Hi, my name is Guy Levinger. I am the CTO of BLXC Security. We are a cybersecurity company from Israel based on Tel Aviv. What we do is we test business logic for enterprises, and we are validating open API specifications for everyone else. What we do is we take in an open API spec and we test it, assuming the open API spec was actually generated from something and that it's reflecting the source code. We assume that, and we can alert you on potential problems with your parameter validation or stuff like that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Without specs, API specs, most of the teams are blocked, right? Testers cannot write tests without specs. People working on dependent applications cannot write code for their applications that uses that API and so on and so forth. So then, if everybody is blocked, or many are blocked without specs, then probably the decision how to write those specs is based on what gets you the specs fastest. Would that be the criteria?
Yeah, we found it to be the case. Most people that gave us specs directly to test them used a third-party platform as a service kind of thing, like Heroku, Netlify, stuff like that, where they just added a plugin and it created the spec for them. So what they did I mean, yeah, you mentioned it. A spec is the bottleneck in the documentation. There are tools that take specs and create automated documentation. There are tools that take in specs and create unit tests, stuff like that. And we find that the top concern is speed, yes, along with accuracy, because some of these tools are not fairly accurate and they'd rather fix some stuff manually so people won't get confused.
In the cases you mentioned, like Netlify, for example, right? How important are APIs in cases of companies using Netlify? Because I imagine that not many dependent applications are in systems like that, right? That's more like a single 1, 2, 3 applications, maybe not really large systems, right?
Yeah, it's mainly some small microservices, yet even those should be documented and tested. We got more cases of other API gateways like Kong or AWS API gateway based OAS OpenAPI specification, stuff like that. We even got people that created their specifications from their live traffic logs because they realized their documentation was lacking. We get it from many places. It's not really dependent on the environment where the application is launched. If it has an API, they'd like to document it somehow.
It seems strange to me that you would use the live traffic logs to document an API, because if the endpoint wasn't known, how did they know to even make the call to the endpoint?
Well, it's rather retroactive. There are some tools that allow you to do so, like retroactive documentation. When a startup rushed into production without documenting everything, they just needed to get the product out there for their design partners, for their early users, because it is a concern. Yet they didn't document everything about their APIs for future developers, for future clients, stuff like that. So what they do is they use the traffic data in order to condense it into an open API specification, and from there to move forward. It's mainly when they don't have the type of gateway that allows a plugin and yielding of an open API specification.
That reminds me of testing in general, Darren, when you have 10-year-old application without a single test, then you say, we're going to write tests. And from now on, it will be all tested. And I never understood why. I mean, I understand why you should be testing, right? But if you have something that is already live, and you obviously did not care about that something in the context of testing or context of documenting API and so on and so forth, it's almost, why don't you focus maybe on something else in a way?
I don't understand why you would bother documenting something legacy, because it's already been in use. What's the purpose? I don't. It's a waste. It's putting on a show, in my opinion. We're just trying to fill time, and that's a bad idea.
I wouldn't call it a waste. It's more like, the big question is, couldn't you find a better return of investment?
Well, most of those kinds of documentations come after an event of some sort, like a major bug that clients were angry about, something changed in the company. And yes, sometimes it's for show. Even legacy applications, when they're running for a decade, they could still develop new bugs when someone patches in something. They may have regression in functionality, stuff like that. And even legacy applications should still be tested in a way, even if they don't have tests to begin with.
That's a typical situation when we have a bug in production. And then, why didn't you write tests? Or why didn't you specify what it is? And from now on, we are going to all write tests and specify, but you're not going to do it now. Now we have urgent issues. Now we need to fix production. And it gets forgotten again, right?
Yeah, that's why those exact tools exist, because they answer that need in particular. Again, documentation is always important, but with all the startups that we talk to, we found that it always takes like third to fifth place. Like first production, then tests, then documentation, if there is time. Because there is no money in documenting your API. There is money in getting it out of production. There is money in making sure it works sometimes at least, but there is no direct money in documenting it. So it's usually getting skipped over for when you have the time or the resources or the special person who can do that particular thing.
I'm assuming you're saying that there's no money in documenting it for internal APIs. It seems like it's the exact opposite. The better that you document your APIs, in whatever way that is, OpenAPI is the way in 2022, it seems like that's what you have to do. Otherwise, you're going to be wasting a lot more time.
Do you know the term that's a future me's problem? That's future me's problem.
Oh, I know the term. I think it's a lazy term, but yeah, I understand it.
In large companies, there is no excuse. I mean, they have the money, they have the resources, they have the developers to do it. Come on, just do it. But in smaller companies that just want to get to production, I can excuse it. I mean, we document our APIs and everything in our system pretty well, but that's because we saw the other side, the spooky side, where if you don't document stuff well, stuff gets patched, and then the regressions happen, and then some hacker can come in and abuse your internal logic. So we do it pretty well, but most startups push it back, and we get lazy on doing some things that some other startups consider a higher priority. So it's time management. That's the name of the game.
Well, if people are trying to get back time and they're not wanting to document, I guess what I'm going at is, as a startup, if a core piece of my startup is an API that's to be publicly consumed, to me, right behind the code, being in production, in lockstep with that, I have to have the documentation in order for other people to consume that API.
Yes, and that's why my suggestion would be to launch it on a platform that will yield for you the OpenAPI specification or any type of specification for the API. Because again, doing it yourself, you don't have the resources, but doing it automatically, it would also give you a fair chance of realizing some critical issues, like not defining the proper length of strings or not defining boundaries on parameters, stuff like that. It will raise those flags. So again, my recommendation for any startup is launch on a known environment with the platform as a service type of thing, so you can yield yourself your specification.
To me, that almost seems lazy. You're getting economies of scale, I guess, by picking Kong, AWS API Gateway, whatever the choice is that you're deciding on. But if you're tying your application to a specific gateway, is that such a great idea?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. You should be cloud agnostic because we're in kind of an early stage startup. We just got our seed. We're just getting our seed, and we are granted pretty hefty amount of cloud credits from multiple cloud vendors. So yeah, I get the wish to hop across clouds, but it's not exactly that good of a thing. I mean, from what we could learn from other startups who've been there before, they told us, pick your infrastructure, stick with it. Gateways would rarely change. Your core infrastructure would rarely change unless you choose to scrape and rewrite it, but it shouldn't be necessary. If you work with optimization in mind, it should be okay. So that's what we did. I mean, it could be construed as kind of lazy, but again, time constraints and the need to get something into production as quickly as possible.
So what are other challenges that people are facing today with APIs? I mean, apart from being lazy, doing it late, or specifying it late.
The most critical challenge is thinking of everything, because when you have an API or any application actually, but an API in particular, you put yourself in the shoes of your users, and your users are developers like you. So you know that they would abuse your API if they are able to find a loophole and abuse it. They would use it more times than you wanted them to. They would do more things that you wanted them to. They would pay less if they could find a way to do that. They would use it for something else than it was intended for. I mean, they would do everything because they are developers or DevOps like you. So it's the most concerning things for a developer-based startup because none of the top developers in my company go to sleep well at night. I mean, we are always afraid that someone will figure out some random edge case that allows them to do something that we did not intend them to, or upload some enormous payload to our system and cost us a lot. Yeah, it's scary. Thinking of everything, I would say, is the major problem.
So I'm going to go back with that. If instead you would define your API to begin with, would you have those same concerns?
Well, I think they wouldn't be as great, but defining it before you start developing it, well, it's not really the startup or SMB kind of way. It may be the enterprise kind of way, but when you get down from the enterprise to smaller companies with like even 100 developers, it's not the way. You define something and then it changes while you develop it. And then someone instructs another feature to be added, and then someone changes this. It's fairly dynamic. So defining it before you start developing it seems kind of naive for a very dynamic environment. It would actually take some of the stress off, but it wouldn't help in the long term because you would need to like create the code from it all the time.
I understand what you're saying there, but even, and I'm going to use AWS's API gateway as the example, I still have to define whatever my API is going to be an API gateway. I don't define the implementation, but I have to define the endpoints, right?
Yes, and they actually get defined. Yeah, actually, that's a great case. But when you define a gateway endpoint, you do not get the code from AWS. I mean, yes, it gets defined, but let's say you have an API gateway and then you have some Lambda functions behind it. When you define an API gateway endpoint, the Lambda that stands behind it does not get a specific code and some validations from what you defined in the API gateway. It gets the raw input. I mean, the raw input mapped into some sort of an object, but the raw input.
But as an API developer, isn't that what I'm most concerned about? If I'm concerned about creating the contract, implementation detail is implementation detail. If I don't get the API contract correct, nothing else matters.
The API contract in and of itself is concerning, but this is the easy part. The difficult part is after you got the contract right, then the implementation needs to take it a step further and actually use what you got from the end user. Using it might actually be the most frightening thing because you just got data from a user. You've barely tested it. You use the WAF and you use the API gateway, which could screen off some things, but not really. You got raw data from a user. You should use your own internal logic, your application's business logic on that data. And you don't know what the data is. So you start checking what it is. You say, well, if it has this attribute, then do this. If it doesn't have this attribute, then return with nothing. Return a 500 status code because it's not the right input. You should validate your input, and that's where scary stuff may happen when you don't do it. This is the very scary thing that most people would try to abuse. The input validation in and of itself is the thing that matters in API validation.
So as you're talking about API validation, one tool that BLST has that's open source is called Cherry Bomb.
Yeah, we help validate open API specifications. We check them out, assuming, again, that they are yielded automatically and not written by hand. So we test them. We assume that every missing validation that we can see in the specification itself is also missing in the code. And we alert about everything. If a user needs a set of permissions to access an endpoint that requires a different set of permissions, if you did not define the max length of a string or an array, if you have additional properties allowed, which may be vulnerable to HTTP pollution, stuff like that. We're taking this specification and considering it the case. So we test it statically. And then, and right now we are implementing some active tests to actually validate the fact that your API actually works as it says in the specification and does not have those sorts of gaps.
Can you give me an example of that verification? Are you checking, like, you told me it was post, but in reality it was put, or what does that look like?
An example of a check is when we test for permissions given to an endpoint, permissions given to a user in an endpoint. We read through the entire security policy of the OpenAPI specification, and then we can test for each endpoint and method what permissions were given to a user. Let's say if a get method gets granted write permissions. That's too much permissions for a get. It shouldn't cause anything, but it may. Those kind of things are easy to spot and should be fixed right away. So we alert on those. Another check would be checking the maximum length of a string. I don't want to be able to put a gigabyte long string into your API just because you did not check the strings you're getting should be between 0 and 256 characters length. Again, those kind of stuff are easily fixable, easily detectable, and we help you detect those quickly.
Just following up on your example, if you specify, okay, so this field cannot receive a value that is above 1K or whatever, right? Does that really prevent client from sending bigger?
Not sending it in particular, but it prevents you from actually processing it. If you do it correctly in most languages, there are some ways to test the length of a string, of the size of an int without actually processing it. What you do when you test it is, again, you've received a string in the size of a gigabyte, which has over 1 billion characters. And now what do you want to do? Do you want to stop it right behind the gateway, like stand there, and if the len is bigger than something, then just stop, don't process it? Or do you want to stop it while processing it? It would cost you much more money if you stop it while processing, rather than simply look at the size that it has and dropping it. It will help both performance and monetary concerns of infrastructure.
So again, I mentioned that Cherry Bomb is open source. If you want to try it out, you can pick it up. It's on GitHub, right?
Yeah, it's on GitHub. Yeah, you can use the installation script to download it, and it would set up anything needed. And you can also just scan your OpenAPI specification in our website. There is a pretty fun web UI if you're more of a web UI kind of person. Cherry Bomb is always being updated, and we're always adding more features, and we're open to requests from everyone. Victor should know. If there is any feedback, anything needed, anything wanted, anything else you want us to bump to the head of the line, let us know.
So if somebody wants to scan their OpenAPI spec, and assuming that it's on the public, so you don't have to worry about it, you can go to blstsecurity.com. And if I remember right, there was a button somewhere that says scan your API or something. Yeah.
On the front page of a huge arrow into a huge dropping space.
All of Guy's contact information will be down in the show notes. Guy, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.